Hello, my name is Professor Tom Solomon. I'm here at the University of Liverpool where I'm a neurologist and I work on brain infections and other neurological problems. I'm going to read to you today a little bit from my book, Roald Dahl's Marvellous Medicine. Many years ago when I was a junior doctor, I looked after the world famous author and we became friends and spent a lot of time chatting. And I discovered that Roald Dahl was fascinated by all things medical. And indeed, during his life, dealt with some really terrible medical tragedies by coming up with some great medical inventions. And I'm going to tell you about one of them today. Late one evening, Dahl told me the very sad story about his son Theo. In the mid-1960s, when Theo was just a baby and their family were living in New York, he suffered a head injury because he was involved in a road traffic accident. The pram that he was being pushed in was hit by a taxi. The family were devastated. Theo was rushed to hospital and he survived, but he had hydrocephalus, water on the brain. Theo's hydrocephalus was treated with insertion of a shunt, but back then the shunts were very rudimentary and they had very rudimentary valves, and Theo's shunt kept blocking up. This is what Roald Dahl wrote about it. I'm going to read a couple of sections from my book. "I don't think much of the tubes that they use here for this work," Roald Dahl wrote to his mother, "particularly the valve at the lower end, which is meant to open up between 40 and 80 millimetres of water pressure. This valve is literally nothing but a slit in the plastic tube. Do they have anything better in England? Something less likely to block and clog?" There was nothing better in England, but Dahl came across a neurosurgeon called Kenneth Till, who was Britain's first paediatric neurosurgeon and had been newly appointed to London's Hospital for Sick Children at Great Ormond Street. Like Dahl, Till was keen to try to improve upon the current valve technology, inviting Dahl into the operating theatre to see shunt operations and discuss alternative strategies. Dahl had two ideas for Theo. The first was to simply remove the draining system, which seemed to be causing so much trouble, and see what happened. Till doubted that this would work. Dahl's second suggestion was to develop a completely new device. But the question was, who would build such a device? Dahl had an idea: a toy maker. Just as the toy maker saves the day in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, for which Dahl would later write the screenplay, it was a toy maker on whom Dahl called for help now. He had known Stanley Wade for many years, from when they would make and fly model planes together on a nearby hillside near Amersham. In reality, Wade did more than make toys. He was a highly skilled hydraulic engineer who crafted miniature engines for model planes as a hobby. I remember when Dahl told me about him. He was a beautiful turner of metal. Dahl enacted this with his hands. He could make anything, turn a tiny steel component to an accuracy of 10,000th of a millimetre. And he was a lovely chap. Dahl smiled slowly. An eccentric, retired fellow with nothing much to do. "We produced this splendid little valve," Dahl went on, "most precise. It had to be non-return, open at a certain pressure, not clog up. You understand?" I nodded as Dahl drew a sketch for me on the back of the day's Times newspaper. "Of course it was Ken and Stanley who really did it all, not me," said Dahl. "Till worked tremendously. I didn't really do much. I was just the go-between, finding out what he wanted and letting Stanley know." At the time, I took what Dahl said at face value. I later heard him say various similar things in recorded interviews, and it was only more recently, when trawling through the notes from the time, that I realised Dahl wasn't being completely straight. So I'd been able to go and visit the Dahl Museum and the archives, which are private archives, but they allowed me, the family very kindly allowed me to have a look through them all. And I came across all sorts of notes in Dahl's handwriting, diagrams, etc. And it was clear that Dahl had actually been heavily involved in developing the valve. he was an interesting guy. And in some ways, for example, with his wartime exploits, when he talked about his plane coming down in Libya, he liked to paint himself as a hero and exaggerate rather. But with the development of the shunt and the valve, he seemed to minimise his involvement. But as I discovered, he really was the driving force. The paper for the valve production, the scientific paper, was published in The Lancet. And I remember being amazed one day in the archives to see words that looked familiar to me. I was familiar with the Lancet publication, but I could see in handwriting words which were familiar. And then I realised this was actually the very first draft of the Lancet manuscript, and Dahl had written the whole thing himself. So it was interesting. He really was heavily involved, but liked to play down his role. Now, they didn't just make a valve for Theo. They made thousands of them, which were used across the world. The valve was taken up, Dahl told me, and used in all sorts of places: India, Kenya and Tanganyika. That's Tanzania now. He told me this with a faraway look. We charged more for the rich countries, America and England, so that it was cheaper for the poorer ones. In the West, the valve cost $21, which would be about $130 today. But Dahl thought this was just too low a price. I'm still worried about the psychology of customers, virtually all of whom think that something inexpensive is inferior, he wrote to Till. He made sure that the British and American advertising emphasised the non-profit nature of the valve's production, and he gave advice on how it should be promoted in America. America is America, he declared, and many advertisers have discovered to their cost that Americans are not impressed by understatement. It's not in their character, and all the American surgeons I know are flamboyant and rather loud. They sell themselves in the most aggressive manner, and they expect others to do the same. Dahl was also keen to promote the valve in the UK, not because he was interested in sales, but because he wanted to share its benefits. He attended the annual meeting of the Society for Research into Hydrocephalus and Spina Bifida in York in 1964, and the following year it was invited to the Parents Association for the Northwest group of this organisation. He invited the treasurer of the Northwest group, a guy called Ian Wilson, with whom he'd been corresponding, to visit them at Gypsy House. This group was one of several across England, Wales and Northern Ireland that joined together in 1966 to form the National Association for Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus. Many of you will know that as ASBA. And ASBA, of course, was renamed as SHINE, Spina Bifida Hydrocephalus Information Networking Equality, the organisation that we're all involved with today. And SHINE, of course, celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2016. So I'm going to stop there, but I thought you'd be interested in this story and how Roald Dahl's tragic family accident led to him forming the valve, which not only used in thousands around the world, we still sometimes come across them in older patients who had the valve. It was called the Wade Dahl Till valve inserted, and we still sometimes find them in older neurosurgical patients. And the links of that to ASBA and indeed to your charity, SHINE. What I should also say, I nearly forgot, is that you can buy this book, Roald Dahl's Marvellous Medicine, if you want to know more about that story and his other great medical inventions, how he was involved in the formation of the Stroke Association and how and why he was a great campaigner for measles vaccination after sadly one of his children died of measles affecting the brain. And you can get the book on Amazon or in bookshops, and all the proceeds from the book go to charities working in areas of interest to Dahl, including SHINE charity. Thanks very much.